Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this lecture in international trade theory. So today I would like to give an overview of how trade theory developed over time. I'll start with the approach which has the longest history, and we will end up with the Krugman model, which is the newest approach to international trade. We want to find out whether international trade is beneficial, yes or no. This is the most important question, which is in the focus of international trade theory. So let's start with the first approach, which is called mercantilism. And there is a quote of Thomas Moon from 1664. And this quote describes and condenses very much the thinking of the mercantilist approach. Thomas Moon said, "The ordinary means, therefore, to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, when we must ever observe this rule, to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value." So Thomas Moon is very clear. He argues that international trade is beneficial, but international trade is only beneficial when exports are larger than imports, so when one country is running a current account surplus. Let's have a deeper look into this mercantilist view. So mercantilism, it's a collection of economic thoughts during the time period 1500 to 1750. It dominated the economic thinking and the governmental policy. The main idea was that national wealth is reflected in a country's holding of valuable metals, so gold and silver. And this is very interesting because of the fact that the big question is, where does this gold and silver end up? It ends up in the pockets of the king. So one country which is very successful in international trade and is running a trade balance surplus, so exporting more than is importing, then this economy will acquire gold and silver coins, because at this point in time, goods and services were paid in gold and silver. Where does this gold and silver coins end up? In the end, it ends up in the cellar of a castle of a king, and hence this king will become richer and richer and richer. During this time period, we had a static view of world resources. The idea was that world resources are constant, so the number of gold and silver in the world is constant. Furthermore, it was believed that economic activity is a zero-sum game. This implies that when one country is running a current account surplus, another country is running a current account deficit. So when one king is acquiring gold and silver coins, another king will lose gold and silver coins. And this is very important because a king which has a lot of gold and silver is able to afford a lot of soldiers, so he's mightier compared to other kings. And when one king is acquiring gold and silver coins, he can increase the number of soldiers, while another king has to decrease the number of soldiers. So one king is gaining power via international trade. This implies that economic activity should be regulated. For example, imports should be restricted. Imports should be restricted because imports would lead to an outflow of gold and silver, and then the king would lose gold and silver coins. Furthermore, we have exclusive trading rights for certain routes or areas. Special companies have granted the right to trade in these areas or routes. So we have a monopolistic situation, and this is very easy to control compared to a situation where each and everyone can export. So here we have these exclusive trading rights so that the king can monitor how much is exports, how much is exported, and how much gold and silver coins are collected on the one or the other route. Capital controls is important, so the king needs to know how much capital is going out, how much capital is going in. The king, of course, wants to keep the gold and silver coins within his economy. Furthermore, exports are subsidized. Exports are subsidized so that the price of exports goods is very low, so that this economy can be successful in international trade. How can we subsidize exports? Of course, by keeping the wages low. This is a very important idea, to keep the wages low. Labor in this time period is very important. It's a very important factor of production. And when we keep the labor cost low, then the exports prices can be kept very low and our economy can have success in international trade. But here already a kind of paradox pops up. A rich nation in the mercantilist sense is an economy where we have very large number of very poor people. The people are very poor because the king is trying to keep the wages relatively low. So gold and silver was accumulated at the expense of current consumption. This is very interesting. Mercantilism means a rich nation is a nation where we have very poor workers, where the society is living in very poor conditions. Adam Smith, in the year 1776, he has a different view on the economy. He was writing something in his very famous book, The Wealth of Nations. Smith said, a nation's wealth is reflected in its production and consumption possibilities and not in its holding of precious metals. So, in case that one economy is able to produce a lot, the society is also able to consume a lot, and he believes that the wealth of a nation is reflected by the production and the consumption possibilities. This is a completely different view compared to the mercantilist view. Adam Smith, he believes that the growth in production can be fostered best in an environment where people are free to act in their own interest. Perhaps you are aware of this famous quote where Adam Smith asked, why is a baker standing up so early in the morning to make the bread and so on? It's not because the baker is such a good man and he wants to do something good for society. No, this is not the case. The baker is acting in his best interest by standing up early in the morning because he's so good in making bread and he wants to make a profit out of making bread. This is very important, that everybody is able to act in his or her own interest, and this will increase the production possibilities and thereby will also increase the consumption possibilities. Adam Smith, he was not coming up with a theory of international trade. We have to wait a few years until David Ricardo comes up with the first international trade theory. So let's have a look at the second chapter, Ricardo, Absolute and Comparative Advantages. You can see here a picture of David Ricardo. He lived from 1772 until 1823. In the year 1817, he wrote the book Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And in this book, he wanted to come up with some very nice arguments to support the British or the English government to find some nice arguments that the Portuguese country should trade with England. In this time period, it was a case that Portugal was the country which was advanced in a technological sense. So they had the better production functions, they had the higher stand of knowledge, and they were ahead compared to England. Nevertheless, Ricardo wanted to construct some nice arguments so that in the end, the government of England has some good arguments to convince Portugal that Portugal should trade with England. Let's have a look at the assumptions of Ricardo's theory. We are looking at two countries, England and Portugal. We are looking at two goods, cloth and wine, and we have only one factor of production. We are looking at a production function where we are only including labor. Look at that. Ricardo, he formulated his ideas in 1817. So it's not the case that we are producing with too much capital. So a lot of things were not invented in 1817, so that labor is still a very important factor of production. We have the following input-output relationship. Labor L is equal to A times the quantity Q produced. The variable A, it represents the labor requirements, the units of labor we need to produce 1 unit of output. So in case that we want to produce 1 unit of output, we need A units of labor. In case that we want to produce 2 units of output, we need 2 times A units of labor. Furthermore, an important assumption is that the technology and the production functions differ between the two countries. The two countries are producing with different production functions because of the fact that the stand of knowledge is different. And therefore, we are looking at two countries which have different relative prices in autarky. In the table below, we find the different labor requirements in England and Portugal in the two different industries. So, for example, the 3 in England in the cloth industry has to be interpreted in the following way. We need 3 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth. In the British wine industry, we need 6 hours of labor to produce 1 bottle of wine. In Portugal, it is the case that we only need 2 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth and 1 unit of labor to produce 1 bottle of wine. When you compare these labor requirements in Portugal and England in the cloth industry, you can see that the labor requirements are lower in Portugal. So Portugal has an absolute advantage in the cloth industry. They really know how to make cloth. They know it better than England. They are advanced in the cloth industry. But also when you look at the wine industry, it's a case that the labor requirements in Portugal are definitely lower than in England. So in England, we need 6 hours of labor to produce wine, and in Portugal only 1. So Portugal also has a so-called absolute advantage in the wine industry. In order to find out whether the one or the other country has a so-called comparative advantage, we have to compute the opportunity cost of producing wine. The opportunity cost of producing wine in England are equal to 2 units of cloth for 1 unit of wine. Why is that? In case that we want to produce 1 unit of wine more in England, we need 6 hours of labor. Where do we get this labor from? We get the labor from the cloth industry in England. And when we are extracting 6 units of labor from the British cloth industry, it's a case that cloth production will decrease by 2 units. So in order to produce 1 unit of wine, cloth production has to shrink by 2 units. So the price of 1 bottle of wine in England is 2 units of cloth. How large are the opportunity costs of producing wine in Portugal? In Portugal, in order to produce 1 unit of wine, we need 1 unit of labor. Where do we get this labor from? We get it from the cloth industry. In case that the wine industry should increase by 1 unit, it is a case that we need this unit from the cloth industry. And when we extract this 1 unit of labor from the cloth industry, cloth output will decrease by 0.5 units. So 1 unit of wine in Portugal costs 0.5 units of cloth. When we now compare the opportunity cost of producing wine in England and in Portugal, it's a case that wine is relatively cheap in Portugal. So Portugal has a comparative advantage in the wine industry, and England has a comparative advantage in the cloth industry. Let's check what can be produced and what can be consumed in the autarky scenario. Autarky scenario, this is a scenario where no international trade takes place. Each country produces and consumes in isolation, no international trade. Let's have a look at the assumptions. We assume that each country has 600 units of labor in total. And in the autarky scenario, each country splits this labor units 50-50 among both sectors. So we have 300 units of labor in the British cloth industry and 300 units of labor in the British wine industry. How many units of cloth and wine can be produced with 300 units of labor? When we put 300 units of labor in the British cloth industry, we can produce 300 divided by 3, 100 units of cloth. In the British wine industry, we can produce 300 divided by 6, 50 units of wine. What about the Portuguese case? So also in Portugal, we split the 600 labor units 50-50 among both sectors, so that 300 units of labor are allocated to the cloth industry. 300 divided by 2, Portugal can produce 150 units of labor. In the wine industry, 300 divided by 1, 300 bottles of wine are produced in the Portuguese wine industry. When we sum up, the world production in cloth is 250 units and 350 units of wine are produced worldwide. What is important here is to stress we are still in the autarky scenario, so production in England will stay in England. Production and consumption is the same because no international trade takes place. Now, after we have characterized the autarky scenario, we want to have a look at the scenario where international trade is allowed. We'll come up with one assumption. We will assume that England will produce more cloth because England has a comparative advantage in the cloth industry, and England will produce less wine. So England produces 1 unit of wine less than before. Portugal has a comparative advantage in the wine industry, and Portugal produces 1 unit of cloth less and will specialize in the wine sector. What happens if this kind of specialization takes place? How many units can be produced in England and Portugal? So we said previously England is producing 50 bottles of wine, and now they are producing 1 bottle of wine less, so the output in the British wine industry is 49. When England is producing less wine, the workers can move from the wine industry to the cloth industry. So 6 units of labor can now be allocated in the cloth industry, and with 6 additional units of labor in the British cloth industry, output in the cloth industry can increase by 2 units, so that 102 units of cloth are produced. Once more, we are producing now 49 bottles of wine in England, 1 less than before, and 6 labor units can move from the wine industry to the cloth industry, and cloth production can increase from 100 to 102 units. Let's switch to Portugal. Previously, in the autarky scenario, Portugal was producing 150 units of cloth. Now Portugal should produce 1 unit of cloth less, so 149 units are produced. Hence, 2 units of labor can move from the cloth industry to the wine industry. And these 2 additional units of labor in the Portuguese wine industry can produce 2 additional units of wine. Therefore, wine output in Portugal is up from 300 to 302. When you now take a sum, you can see that world output increased from 250 units of cloth in autarky to 251 units of cloth in the scenario with specialization. Also, wine output is up from 350 units to 351 units. Hence, we can see in the last row of this table that world output increased, and hence it's just a question of how this additional world output is split between the 2 countries so that both countries can benefit from international trade and benefit from specialization. On this slide, you can see 3 different tables. In the upper right part, you can see the production and consumption quantities in autarky. The second table, once more, contains the production quantities after specialization. And now we want to have a look at the consumption possibilities after international trade. Therefore, we once more need some assumptions, and the assumptions are as follows. The terms of trade are equal to 1 to 1. So the 2 countries are exchanging cloth and wine on a 1-to-1 basis. So the price of 1 unit of cloth in the international market is 1 unit of wine. But we are not assuming that only 1 unit of cloth and 1 unit of wine is exchanged, but England is exporting 1.5 units of cloth and Portugal is exporting 1.5 units of wine. When England is exporting 1.5 units of cloth, 102 units are produced, 1.5 units are exported, so that 105 units of cloth will stay in England. Portugal is producing 149 units of cloth, but is importing 1.5 units of cloth from England, so that the consumption quantities in Portugal with respect to cloth is equal to 150.5. 149 units are produced in Portugal and 1.5 units are imported from England. What about the wine consumption? Portugal is producing 302 bottles of wine, but is exporting 1.5 bottles to England. So 302 minus 1.5 gives us 305 bottles of wine in Portugal. England is producing 49 bottles of wine and is also importing 1.5 units of wine from Portugal. So the consumption possibilities are equal to 50.5 bottles of wine. What is now very important, we have to compare the consumption possibilities in England in the cloth industry in the autarky scenario. So here England was able to consume 100 units of cloth, but now with specialization and international trade, cloth consumption can increase. This also holds for the wine consumption. In the autarky scenario, consumption possibilities were equal to 50 bottles of wine, and now wine consumption can increase to 50.5 bottles. What about the Portuguese economy? In autarky, Portuguese were able to consume 150 units of cloth, and now cloth consumption can increase to 150 in the scenario where the production specializes and international trade takes place. Also, the wine consumption is up from 300 to 305 units of wine. Hence, we can see here that international trade is beneficial. Both countries can consume more cloth and more wine compared to the autarky scenario. Each country was specializing in that industry where the country had a comparative advantage. After the specialization, international trade took place, and then consumption possibilities increased. This stylized example highlights the ideas of David Ricardo. So David Ricardo, he wanted to give some good arguments to the British government so that the British government can convince the Portuguese government to trade with England. It was not that obvious why Portugal should trade with England, because Portugal was ahead. Portugal was ahead with respect to the current stand of knowledge. Portugal was ahead with respect to the production possibilities. So Portugal had an absolute advantage in the cloth industry and an absolute advantage in the wine industry. Nevertheless, Ricardo was able to show why it makes sense that Portugal should trade with England. It's because of the fact that consumption possibilities can increase in England and in Portugal. One interesting story is that when you look at British textbooks nowadays, frequently you find the scenario in the other way around. So in British textbooks, it's frequently the case that it's the British economy which has lower labor unit requirements compared to Portugal. So in British textbook nowadays, it seems to be the case that England is ahead, and England has the better production possibilities and the higher stand of knowledge. But this is not in line with the history. It was the case that Portugal was ahead compared to England. So we are done with a Ricardo model where absolute and comparative advantages play a role. And in the end, it is the case that consumption possibilities increased. Both countries are better off with specialization and international trade compared to the autarky scenario.